It's like this, man. You're like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. That's the wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. These old times.
All right, Dan, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back. And your intro's improved significantly.
Thank you. What can I say? I paid someone for this one, which is why it looks a lot better than the one that I made myself. Video editing is I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemies.
Quite. Yeah. I mean, before I joined the Lotus Eaters, I had a brief stint of trying to do my own channel. And when I realized that after you record a video, you only spend about 3 days messing around with it, I just thought, sod this. I'm going somewhere that has editors.
Fair. I mean, I think that's why I became a podcaster and not a video essayist.
Yeah.
With a podcaster, it's like you might have to take out an instance of a naughty word at best, or if someone's kids run in front of the screen, you blur it. But short of that, I say that I'm infamous for saying I will edit something and then forgetting to. So I picked my.
So are my editors.
Yeah, exactly. My editors are me in 3 hours. So anyway, Dan, I decided to have you on to talk about some interesting developments in British politics, both on a cultural and economic level. Obviously, the thing that's been big in the news, at least recently, has been more migration protests. But there was a story that sort of slipped off everyone's desk about the UK and specifically what seems to be sort of a burgeoning, I guess you would say, sovereign debt crisis. I initially saw comments from a former Bank of England official, Andrew Sentence, basically saying it seemed like, from his perspective, the country needed another IMF bailout. They got in, was it 76, I believe? So the point is, do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because that seems to be a very significant occurrence. Yeah.
I had actually missed that comment myself, but that's fairly significant because he's quite a left-wing economist. He's a Labour's reporting economist. So for him to be saying that, that's quite significant. I'm not sure if the IMF would bail us out because I don't think they've got enough money. So that would be the first problem. Now, yes, the UK is in a financial crisis, and it's something that more people have been talking about recently. But I mean, the reason I started my Brokenomics show on the Lotus Eaters was to talk about what I saw as the financial crisis. To my mind, this has been happening since 2008. So I'm glad that everybody is now talking about it as if it's a current live thing. But the set of problems that we have are fairly endemic. I would go on to say that there is nothing that specifically different about Britain to anywhere else in the Western world. A lot of the problems that we have, and I can describe what some of those problems are problems that you would have in America as well. The big difference, of course, is that you've got the reserve currency. So, yes, I mean, we do have our own currency, so we can print money, but that only gets you so far when there's a limited demand for that externally. So, yes, we can pay internal bills by printing money when we get to that stage, but because successive governments have decided that there is no reason to be energy independent, we should be farming independent, but they've hammered farmers for years. We're dependent on the absolute basics such as energy and food and steel and a whole chemical precursor. I mean, the whole bunch of the base layer of the economy, we're dependent on getting from elsewhere. And because we haven't got the reserve currency, we don't have the options that you've got. But nevertheless, a whole bunch of the stuff that I'm going to be speaking about are problems that are going to be affecting the US and are certainly affecting, Japan, rest of English-speaking world, Western Europe. It's just a question of which of us really goes first. Now, because of your reserve currency, you guys are probably going to go last when it comes to facing the reckoning. But it looks like, possibly it could be Britain is one of the first candidates to be tipped over the edge.
Well, and I'm glad you said that because from my limited amount of economic knowledge, you're entirely correct, right? Every one of these Western countries is facing ultimately the same issues. An aging population, a ballooning welfare state, and shall we say a less real economy, right? A move to a service-based economy. And again, none of these are technically insurmountable issues, but taken all at once, and particularly when you have a government that seems completely and totally unwilling to address those issues, right? It becomes very worrying. So can you explain?
I mean, actually, it might be worth just touching upon that solving the issue part, because I'm entirely confident that if I were to become the Supreme Patriarch of the UK, I could fix all of these issues within a year. What I could not do is run a political party that got elected on the basis of doing any of this stuff. What needs to be done is actually quite straightforward, but you can't do it in a democracy. And a lot of the reason why we've all got into this situation across the Western world is because politicians have quite correctly, for many decades, taken the expedient decisions at the time that maximised their political opportunity in the time span that they were looking at, which is basically the next election, if even that. Sometimes is a much shorter time frame than that. And as a result, they made decisions that are quite unwise for the long term and become increasingly unsustainable in the long term. But it was necessary for short-term political advantage. And of course, once you've started giving people something, you then can't take it away in the future. And so these problems just start to compound and compound. And you add that to what you mentioned just there, the demographic issue, which I think is really kind of one of the core roots of all of this stuff across the Western world, is the age demographic, which then led on to the migrant demographic issue. It sets us up to a situation where these situations look like they're going to be unresolvable, and is going to have to lead to at least one Western government collapsing before there is the political will to do anything.
Well, and this is a point that Nick Land makes, right? He says that a thrifty politician is a genetic dead end, right? They're not going to be able to replicate themselves because obviously, if you have a limited time in office, we'll go with the American model and say 4 years. Well, if you were playing the game over a longer time span, right? If you were, the Grand Shah of England, well, you're playing over a time scale much larger than 4 years. So a decision that benefits you in the short term, but mortgages your future, would not be one you're as likely to take. Whereas if you have a definite amount of time and a definite amount of power you have access to during that limited time, well, all the incentives are set up to smash and grab, right? Take as much as you can while you are there. And especially, and look, you're not going to get me all teary-eyed about democratic norms in America, but as we've seen kind of like the crumbling of certain aspects of the post-war consensus about not prosecuting your enemies, about not ruining their lives, well, that's just jacking that incentive up even higher, because the incentive is not only to enrich myself, increase my own side or my personal political dynasty's power, but also to persecute your enemies or put yourself in a position where you cannot be touched. So it's sort of this like radical acceleration into a banana republic, right? Where even the pretenses, which were fig leaves and pretenses of a previous generation about not doing that, have sort of been discarded. I guess that's maybe a way that we're kind of ahead of you guys on the curve. But I had an interesting conversation with a conservative. I love conservatives, right? They're my people, but they have certain issues, right, when talking about these problems. And I just kind of glibly brought up like, oh, the progressives aren't having kids. And the response was really interesting. It was, oh, that's horrible. I guess we really do need all of these illegal immigrants so someone can pay for my Social Security. And
yeah,
that is the argument, just normally not expressed so honestly, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said. However, you don't even, and I think that's a big part of it, but you don't even need to assume a malice with a lot of this stuff. So, I mean, I mentioned the age demographics. I mean, quite simply, the reason why the Western world is going broke and Japan is going broke faster is because of the baby boom. And I'll explain what happened there. Japan is interesting because it had its baby boom 15 years before the rest of us did. And as a result, they're 300% of debt to GDP, whereas the rest of the Western world is about 100% of debt to GDP. It's simply because their baby boom happened 15 years early. And so you're just basically looking at the future when you're looking at Japan. So what happened is we had the baby boom, and then you had a period in the 80s, and certainly by the later 80s, where you had peak boomer workforce participation, where you had lots of people in the workforce, and it was very easy to make the numbers add up. You often get Reagan and actually the first few years of the Clinton term as well, the Reagan and Thatcher era, where they're sort of lauded for being grave financial stewards and getting everything right and turning everything around. Quite frankly, a monkey in a suit could have done that job at that time, because you had so many boomers in the workforce that you were going to make the sums add up. Now, the reason why that was so significant is because they were a very large generation following a very small generation. And to a non-economist, you might think that you're better off being part of a small generation rather than a large generation, because you think, okay, well, there's going to be less competition. It's actually the completely reverse. And you can see this example with Gen X versus boomers. Gen X barely feature in the conversation. They've never really had their way on anything. They're included in the political process to a certain extent, but you can see them sort of being skipped over from boomers to millennials. So what the problem with the large boomer generation was, and there's no maliciousness about it, is they were very prosperous in the late 80s and early 90s, and they looked at their parents' generation, the greatest generation, and they realized that these guys were poor. I mean, being old and poor was basically the same thing. If you wanted to implement a government program to help poor people, well, you just targeted at old people and you achieved the same thing. So, I mean, this is the case certainly in the UK, but I mean, you also did it with Medicare, I think it was. I always get Medicaid and Medicare the wrong way around, but I think that's right. Certainly what happened over here is they looked at this older, poorer generation and said, well, look, it would be so easy for us to increase pensions. It would be so affordable for us to do that. It would also be very affordable to increase the role of the NHS. Now, these were done with the best of intentions, and they were very affordable at the time. But the only element of malice came into it is as time went by, they started to look at these and think, oh, we get those when we're old as well. So maybe it's worth kind of really locking them in. So things like that become entrenched in the system, and that's something you can never take away. Now, when you get to the point where we're getting to now, which is the boomer generation are rolling off, they're almost all exiting the workforce as we speak. The older boomers are already gone. Even the younger boomers are getting very close, if not to the point where they're choosing to go into retirement. You don't have that ratio of workers to retired people anymore. And that kind of leads us on to the second problem, which is causing a lot of cultural issues within the UK, which is, I don't know how bad it is in the US, but certainly over here, our government bureaucracies make very silly assumptions. And some of these silly assumptions are that the size of the economy, I mean, you could look at GDP as GDP per capita times capita. So the number of people times, what they earn. So what they think is, well, and the average Englishman is completely interchangeable with an Eritrean. Why wouldn't they be? We know that liberal theory tells us that people are completely interchangeable. So if we want to increase GDP to pay for all these boomer pensions and the NHS and everything else came with it, well, obviously what you do is you import about 1 million people a year from Africa, and then they simply increase the GDP by the same proportion as another English. If you just magically conjured up another 1 million Englishmen. That hasn't worked. So you can see how the first problem leads directly onto the second problem. The issue that we've got, I mean, at least in your country, is that when you had your mass immigration wave, you had your 4 years of mass immigration streaming over the border, is you didn't immediately put them on welfare. Although you can probably correct me and tell me that, there is some payments going to them somehow. Over here, we basically just get people in, give them a flat and put them on benefits. So not only are they not contributing, but we're basically battery farming the least productive people from Africa to come over here and make the fiscal situation even worse. But it still works for the politicians to do that, because when the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, does their sums, they say, oh, you've got an extra 1 million people, and therefore you can expect the tax base to be higher in the future. And what had been happening for a long time is the bond market would sort of defer to a certain extent to the numbers coming out of the OBR saying that, okay, well, this looks fine, and therefore I'm not going to demand an excessive premium for buying this government debt. Increasingly, they're just not believing the numbers anymore. And that's what's become acute over the period of over the last year or so, is the complete lack of faith in the numbers coming out of the government, and actually the people who are doing the gilt buying, the government bond buying, are basically just coming to the conclusion, no, this doesn't add up anymore. I'm going to demand an ever higher premium, and that is happening across the Western world. It's also happening in your country, but it just seems to be particularly acute here.
Well, I think you're correct, and especially both a lot of Americans and a lot of Europeans don't understand the relatively higher standard of living of the average American, right? Like if you adjust for purchasing power parity, the average in the US is about $51,000 plus or minus. It changes, right, depending on who you ask. The lowest state in the US, I believe, is Mississippi, which is at like 36 or 37,000. Mississippi has been poor for forever. It sort of is what it is. It's still
richer than us.
Exactly, right? So, and also we had our massive wave of migration. And to be fair, we've been having mass migration for a very, very long time. So in absolute numbers, right, it's an immense amount of people. But you had similar numbers in a much smaller, comparatively poorer country over much smaller amounts of time. So to be honest, it's just harder to launder in your country than it is in ours, right? One of the other things that's been, and it's always difficult to tell how much there will be sort of a truth and reconciliation committee on the Biden administration, but you do see little flashes of it, right? Of, migrants being sent to, prominent American cities with, debit cards with 20 grand on them, right? Just given free money. But we did it in kind of a sneaky way, right? It was from USAID grants to charities with no trail of accountability. So it was very difficult to say, is this person getting government money? I mean, yes, they were, right? But the example that you've mentioned, right, of just being given, council housing, right? Not quite Section 8, but close enough for the sake of comparison. In a country that is undergoing a housing crisis, right, with supposedly year-long waits for public housing, and 8 guys in a rubber dinghy roll up, get shuffled to the front of the line. It's a very, and I don't know why, but talking about your country almost makes me more angry than almost anything else, because it's such a concentrated version of what we see everywhere. Well,
at least the US is meant to be a mixing pot. It's meant to be. I mean, and you had an interesting situation when you had the original Anglo settlers, but you had an enormous continent to fill out, and you're not going to do that by waiting for Englishmen to breed. I mean, we just don't breed fast enough. So, you had to go through the successive waves of immigration, across the European continent. You started expanding out, and then you kind of got a little bit looser as you went as to where people were going to come from. But at least you've got that heritage. But with us, we are supposed to be the home of the English, and we're being sort of displaced. And there's no coming back from that. Unless we do something about it, which then leads into the whole swathe of cultural problems we've been having lately.
Well, and this is something that is a sore subject for many Americans, because that language has been weaponized to say, therefore, you are not allowed to have problems with airdropping 1 million Somalis into 98% rural Maine, which is not the point, right? There were a series of, you could almost consider them like different dispensations or American republics in the same way that the French number it, right? And as you've said, the scope of who was considered for immigration expanded. And honestly, a big part of it is that the term white really only makes sense in a colonial or American context, because when you were fighting an entire continent full of cannibals, well, okay, yeah, sure, halfway across the world, you and that French guy might have been mortal enemies. Well, all of a sudden you're in the same group. So it produces sort of an ethnogenesis in a different way, right? It forces a sort of common ground. And let's also be honest, America was at its most prosperous when it was receiving its least number of immigrants. It's poorly phrased, but you understand what I mean. And so, in our situation, you look at even the Irish and the Italians, who are, kind of the butt of many jokes, and rightfully so. It's like, okay, well, that is another sort of European, right? You had in your country a great deal of Polish immigration. And all right, I'd say that the gap between an English or an Englishman in a poll is probably greater than, an Anglo-American and an Irish guy, right? But still, right, there's within some sort of identifiable civilization. Whereas in your case, you mentioned Eritrea, right? This is from a very, very different culture. And specifically, what I have seen happening, and I'm taking this information from Dutton, so I didn't just pull it out of nowhere, but the concentration of these sort of migrant hotels or, council housing has sort of reached saturation in urban centers. There's simply no place to put additional migrants. So according to him, they've sort of started seeding these colonies, to be honest, in smaller towns, right? In vacation towns, like Epping has been at the center of the news for a while. And so first of all, is that correct? And to what degree has, the kind of wider concentration of these migrants inflamed tensions?
Yeah, we've been having problems with migrants. Going back to the early days. You can find instances of the rape gangs occurring in the 1950s. So basically, as soon as they started occurring, they started realizing we're a soft touch. But the authorities have basically always covered it up. What was particularly problematic was during the 70s. I think in the early 70s, there was a big flood in a rural region of Pakistan, which is the most backward part of Pakistan as well, who have very problematic relationships with fathers and daughters and all the rest of it, not to mention strangers. And we started bringing a large number of them in, and we sort of continue this to this day. And the new arrivals as well, their morals aren't any better. And of course, when you start bringing them in, it's exceeded the capacity of the state to cover this stuff up anymore, especially with the advent of social media. And we realize that these attacks are taking place. And we also realize that the government, from their point of view, to try and help manage the situation, have effectively been covering it up, and they've been covering up for years. And anger is boiling over. Now, as to the point of what they're sort of doing with these people, well, the first instance is to put them in hotels, but we are talking about the people who come over in boats here. So, and that is not, we're different to you in the US in that our problem was not illegal migration. Illegal migration makes up something like 50, 60,000 people coming over on boats. A larger number than that comes over on the back of lorries and stuff. But actually the biggest problem has been legal migration, that the government simply let them in. Anybody who made any halfway convincing excuse to come here would have been granted a license to do so by the government. Now, if they come over here legally, of course, they get immediate access to the full range of benefits that we can provide, or they more commonly go and work some food takeaway or something like that, quite often brought over by extended family, that sort of thing. So actually, the illegal migrant issue is smaller, but still that's the one that's got all the focus. Now, they've been going into hotels, and there was recently a court case in Epping where there was a sexual assault in Epping, unsurprisingly, and the local council tried to get the hotel shut down, and they initially succeeded, and that's just been overturned at the Court of Appeals. And the argument that the government is making is, well, look, if we don't put them in hotels, we're just going to have to buy up houses and put them in there. The idea that they don't let them stay, or they don't let them get in the first place, never occurs to them. So these people are going to end up being dispersed, and they're going to be put in HMOs, so multi-occupant housing. We've got a company here called Serco that does a lot of the dirty work for the government, so they're just going to go around buying up houses.
But I'm correct in saying that the owner of that firm, I don't remember the name of it, but he's a billionaire now, correct? He's made an immense amount of money.
Yeah, you're probably right. I haven't been following that one closely, but almost certainly, yeah. I mean, the government pays very well to look after these people. Well, not only that, they offer to fully refurbish the hotel as well after they've been in there. So it makes every financial sense for hotel owners to agree to that, and of course, a lot of them have been. But even if you solve the hotel problem, like I said, they're just going to end up in social housing because the government is committed to bringing them in one way or another.
Well, this is something that you saw in the New York City migrant crisis as well. That in response to what was honestly relatively smart politics of the Texas governor just saying, all right, you're not going to help me, so I'm just going to ship them all to New York City. okay, maybe there were some downstream consequences, but it was effective politically, was that they were being forced to house these migrants in high-end hotels in New York at extraordinary expense to, the city. And again, you and I might look at that and say, well, why? They can go away. It's relatively simple, especially in a country like yours, which is, in the grand scheme of things, relatively small and an island, right?
Yep.
Infamously defensible. It's very clearly not a problem of ability. It's a problem of will. Right? They simply do not want to solve that problem. And one of the things that, I've seen in coverage of these protests is it seems as if tensions are running very, very high. Now, obviously, there have been sort of a kind of a run of these protests, right? Obviously, Southport was very, very big. Even before that, there were others. And so I'm curious, could you speak to, what is the feeling on the ground, right? How do people in your country feel about this? Is it still kind of a niche right-wing issue, or does it seem to be catching on in wider culture?
No, it's definitely caught on. I think Southport must have been the turning point on that, because before it's something that people with a right-wing bent would have spoken about. You would have heard it down the pub, people saying, this immigration is out of control. It took a second-generation immigrant running into a dance class and attacking a whole classroom full of girls. And we always talk about the 3 that died. Utterly tragic, of course, but I mean, many others were horrifically injured and will be carrying those injuries for the rest of their lives. It was such an utterly horrific event that the government just couldn't suppress it any longer, and the anger was bubbled over. And since then, I don't know what it is. Maybe the average normie has been more receptive to hearing the other side of the argument on this stuff. And there was increasingly a consciousness amongst the English people that they are being replaced, that billions is being spent on housing and providing services to immigrants, that their children cannot buy a home, or if they've got younger children, that they are in threat. And we're hearing sort of it's like the daily rape now. We hear every day of another rape of an English girl by one of these migrants. And I think people have just stopped worrying about what other people think at this point. And when they've started speaking on it, they've discovered that actually everyone else agrees with them. I can't overstate that, because we still have the lefty, well-to-do middle class in 95% white areas who can still attest
the sort
to
of Guardian reader type.
Yeah, the old liberal shibboleths. So those guys are still there, pretending it's not affecting them. But for anybody who like myself, I actually live in one of those areas myself, but I'm not afraid to speak up on it. But certainly the working class, it started with them, because the cheapest hotels and the cheapest housing is to be found in the working class areas. So overwhelmingly, these people are being put in there, and they are being affected by the sharp end of this. And I think people have basically got to the point where they fear not acting more than they fear acting, because the state will come down on you. Lucy Connolly, for example, is a fairly famous case over here. She tweeted something. She basically said, "I don't care if their hotels get burnt down." You could argue that that's not nice, but all she was saying is, "I don't care if that happened." Hardly an excessive sentiment. And she was sentenced to 31 months in jail. She is out now, thank goodness. But the state clamped down extremely hard on anti-migrant sentiment, and they're hoping they're going to make the issue go away. But all it's done is it's made people realise that the government is desperate to stop this. And why would they be desperate to stop this if it wasn't happening, if it wasn't a very real threat? So, actually, I've been a little bit out of the news cycle for the last 2 weeks, because I went off to Devon, one of the sunniest bits in the UK, quite nice. And I've been driving around quite a lot, and we've been having, the George Cross, the English flag painted on mini roundabouts, because we've got a lot of these mini roundabouts. I know Americans won't know what roundabouts are, but little round things that you drive around.
No, you brought that cancer, that foreign imposition to our land. Now we have them too.
Oh, good. Okay, they're excellent. You'll learn to love them. But we have these smaller versions, which are basically just big white circles. So it's perfect for painting the George Cross on. Flags have been going up all over the place. I'm even seeing it in the sort of wanky middle class area that I live in. And I just get the sense that the government has lost its ability to keep the lid on this, because people truly understand that we are going away as a people if we don't do something soon. And maybe the financial crisis is the thing that, tips the government over the edge and allows real change, because all the time the status quo can be maintained. Of course, it will be.
Well, you sort of see this sort of preference cascade when there's a system set up and there are costs associated with going along with it, and then punishments for not. This was sort of a weird post for Curtis Yarvin to make, but I thought it was sort of interesting because he described something I'd seen many times. As you're no doubt aware, healthcare in America is prohibitively expensive. We sort of have the worst of both worlds, right? A sort of god-awful abomination, like half private, half socialized, and really the worst of both. But Yarvin, right, who's a wealthy man from a blue area, was talking about how many people in his social circle had basically got to the point of going uninsured, right? Just going by cash, because, there are consequences to that, right? You're making a gamble. If you require quadruple bypass surgery, you're hosed. But if you're paying $1,000 a month or $2,000 a month for healthcare, well, all of a sudden, the consequences for going along, it starts to become a choice again. And similarly to your point about looking at, both sides of this, where, certainly there are consequences. They'll throw you in jail for a meme, right? They'll make your life hell. But consequently, if the rewards of going along with the system and the costs as well get to be so high, well, to be honest, there's very little keeping people in line. And one of the other, I guess, kind of interesting things that I've noticed is that at the same time as crime in general is increasing dramatically, right? Obviously, you talked about the daily rapes, but these knife attacks, other crime as well. It seems as if all of the resources within the system are being diverted to people saying things, right? Have been directed in that direction. And obviously, the state has a literal monopoly on violence in the sense that they have the army. But any state requires a certain amount of buy-in, right? You have to go along with it. And when we talk about losing legitimacy, right, losing the mandate of heaven, whatever you want to say, to me, that seems to be happening in the UK. From the outside looking in, and obviously social media distorts everything, but it seems as if people do not look at the government or the police as having legitimate authority anymore. Is that overwrought, or do you think I'm pointing to something accurate?
No, that's absolutely true. The social contract has been well and truly broken at this point. It used to be the case that you played by the rules and then you got the benefits that came with playing by the rules. You got to have a house and a family. But if you're a young guy in Britain today, you're simply not going to get a house. Not unless you get a very large inheritance. You've got no prospect of saving up for it. Every so often the government will come out with a help to buy scheme.
Unaware. You said inheritance, but even then, right, that is a new target, right? The inheritance.
Yeah, that will be going as well. Yeah. This is something that I'm warning my generation, the Gen Xers, is only the oldest Gen Xers are going to get much of the way of inheritance, because that is going to have to go away. Fairly soon as well, because there's just too much money being left on the table by the government. In fact, this makes the government is really out of options. Just returning to the point about the financial crisis, we haven't had a chance to kind of go into the nuts and bolts of it. But if anyone's really interested, if you just search my name in YouTube, I think a interview with Peter McCormack comes up from a couple of years ago, where it's quite a long conversation, but I painstakingly go through the national finances and what the options are for fixing them. And in every case, I demonstrate why that's not going to work. Now, a lot of it is ideological. The obvious thing to do is you cut spending, you start deporting people, but that is ideologically unviable in any democratic system. So there is effectively going to be no way out of this. And the problem that the current Labour government has is every country has a kind of natural ceiling to how far you can tax people. For the UK, it's roughly 37.5% of national income. If you tax up to, and they are already at that level, if you try and go beyond that level, people basically just stop working. Or, you know, a lot of our small businesses, because we have something called it is like a sales tax, a value added tax. We have a fairly low threshold on that. So a lot of small business people will get to like a month or two off from the end of the tax year, and they just stop working because it's not worth going over the threshold. There's lots of things that you can do with tax, but once you get to a certain point, people just stop paying it. Interestingly, France has a higher tolerance for that. They can go into the low 40s, and America has a lower tolerance. You guys get up to like 34%, and then you're done. But because we're already at that level, and because we have a Labour government who's ideologically committed to growing the state as an end of itself, the only solution that they can try is going to be raising taxes. And that could really be the thing that pushes over the edge, because what happens when, you know, the Chancellor stands up and says, okay, yes, there is a big crisis, there's a huge black hole in the finances, but I'm going to raise all of these taxes and that's going to solve the problem. And then Laffer curve effect, they actually collect less. That could be a true crisis point for the UK, and it could push us over the edge. But yeah, absolutely, the social contract is broken, and people just don't feel like playing along with it anymore, because frankly, what they're going to lose, they're not gaining anything in the first place.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because there is this sort of, I guess, kind of residual boomer attitude of like, oh, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Why are you complaining? And obviously on like an A to B level, right? Like, Dan, if you are giving me advice personally, that's good personal advice. But the problem is you need something to get people to buy in. I think one of the reasons that you see so many people in Generation Z checked out, right, completely, you know, unwilling to engage with society, just neats forever, is effectively that, to be honest, the marginal benefit of caring is not very high anymore, right? You either have to be an exceptional individual or particularly gifted, you know, either by circumstance or right place, right time to win, or you can just kind of coast. And it's sort of the really negative thing about the welfare state is it both saps the reward and also provides a consolation prize. And as that sort of verges to, you know, an equilibrium, right? As you said, it's no shock that people aren't working, because again, there is no, or at least there's a very weak correlation between, you know, work in a certain sense and a reward, which again, if we already have, relatively speaking, an aging population where if we have to make these books balance, you would hope for hyper productive young people. So just round numbers, right? If you have half the number of people you need, well, if they're producing twice as much, that works out. But it is this sort of like devilish trap, right? Where it is both ruinously expensive, you know, crushing the economy, and also, you know, crushing I guess you could say like the motivation of, you know, people to enter and engage with the workforce.
Yeah, honestly, there's so many things that I could talk about on the UK's financial situation as to how it's got into this set of problems. It's really no one thing. But another thing that would be worth talking about in this, and this is something of an import from the US, is post 2008, a lot of the lending rules were changed, and banks were basically strongly encouraged to lend pretty much only to government entities or to house buying. The lending for small businesses, starting a new business, a small business that was expanding, a lot of that lending has disappeared in the last, more than a decade at this point. So that kind of explains why you see in the UK a housing boom. Houses are very highly priced, but there's no organic business generation. There's no business expansion. There's no productivity. You know, it's got to the point where I used to be in venture capital. I haven't done it for quite a few years now, but I was speaking to an old friend of mine who is still active in that game. And I Zoomed him, and he's in New York. I was like, oh, okay. What are you doing there then? And he said, well, we just, this is just no point being in the UK anymore. There's simply no point. Every time we invest in a British business, it fails. And actually, the reason that it normally fails is because of some stupid thing that the government does, puts up taxes or changes some rules. COVID was a great one. That managed to annihilate huge swathes of businesses. And he said, look, I'm in the game of making money, and I can do that in the US, but I can't do it in England. And that's what I see. I mean, again, my situation, when I came out of finance, I was the ideal candidate to go and start a business. And I considered it for a long time. And I just thought, well, it's just too stacked against me. What's the point? I'm going to skip all of this. And that's why I kind of ended up just doing a bit of investing on the side and podcasting at the Lotus Eaters. It's because there's kind of at no stage is it worth in this country even making the attempt to do something. And certainly, as you were talking about, the younger guys, the Zoomer guys as well, best they can hope for is get a job somewhere and pay rent. And, their entire life is a series of subscriptions. But they don't have any stake in anything. It's a total malaise. So coming back to the financial crisis, I suppose on one hand, I don't want it to happen, but on the other hand, we need some sort of reset. And if this is the mechanism that pushes us over the edge to throw away all the old shibboleths and the old assumptions, then maybe that needs to happen.
Yeah, I didn't know. I knew you worked in finance. I didn't actually know you were a venture capitalist. There's a surprising number of you guys, VC guys, in our sphere of the internet, which I always thought was sort of an interesting thing. But to that point, right? Yeah, what is the name of that meme? Is it like Nick 30 Anns or something like that? Right?
Yeah.
Where it's like the complicated social contract where basically the point is like, no matter what you do, your money is always being siphoned to someone else. Horribly depressing, but like,
they made a game of that. It's worth looking up. If you want to be thoroughly depressed, search the Nick 30 Anns game. And you can play it. And you're basically a 30-year-old guy trying to get to 35 to own a house. And you can make sort of various life choices as you go along. And basically, it's impossible to win. Your goal just gets further away every time you try and do anything. It's a horribly depressing situation. And, the last thing I want to give young people as advice is to quit Britain. To go elsewhere, but I mean, even I find myself in that situation because I know the Chancellor only understands one thing, and that's putting up taxes. And at a certain point, as much as I love my country and I want to see it fixed, if it becomes financially suicidal, I'm going to have to put my family first at some point. And at that point, I might well be coming to my US friends such as you and saying, where do I go?
Well, if you're looking for a colony, I actually know a pretty good one of our guys, maybe a conversation for off air. But
okay.
In all seriousness, right, you see this very clearly that you are not the only person to come to this same conclusion, right? The amount of millionaires, right, which let's be honest, millionaire means a very different thing than it used to, but still, people who are on the, let's just say like the top 25% fleeing. I don't even want to say the country's stricken by welfare, but the country's most stricken by welfare and taxation, right? It's insane, right? They are losing people who, for good or ill, are drivers of the economy, right? Look, like I'm not some kind of like trickle down, like Reaganite economist. Not my point at all. But fundamentally, you do need rich people in a society, right? They do things that other people cannot. They buy things, they employ people, they're likely to fund either directly or indirectly businesses, right? So regardless of your like ideological precepts of, how much someone should be able to have, if you can adopt that frame, it's like you do need the rich. And to see them fleeing, it is a worrying sign.
The seventh richest man in the UK left last week. The latest numbers I have is something like 16,000 UK millionaires just exited the country. And those figures are almost, I think they are a year old now. So when we get the next update, it'll be interesting to see how many more have fled. But yeah, we have an ideologically left-wing government that believes that rich people are a problem. and they don't pay tax, and they must be made to pay more. Well, the problem is, the reality is that they actually do pay almost all of the tax, and therefore it is a genuine problem when they go, but they cannot find a solution. And I can't even criticize Labour too much, because actually hitting the 37% of national income as a proportion of tax is something that happened under the Tories. The massive spike in immigration is something that happened under the Tories. And this is part of the breaking of the illusion as well, because we've had this sort of two-party political system for over a century at this point. And it goes between what is supposed to be the right-wing option, the Conservatives, and the left-wing option, which is Labour. And when we had the Conservative Party do all of the left-wing things while claiming to be doing right-wing things, that was also a massive part of shattering the illusion. And they probably destroyed themselves as a political party. The world's oldest and most successful political party has probably destroyed itself and will effectively cease to exist as a real political force in this country at the next election. Everything is all the old perceptions that the British used to have about themselves are being shattered at this stage, and it's part of the radicalization that you see growing. And interestingly, there's the growing civil war narrative that is building over here as well.
Mike Betts,
David
is
Betts,
that the guy?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. Professor of War at King's College or something like that. He's been doing the rounds. He's going to come on Brokenomics soon. He's been talking about how for many years he advised the UK government on what to look for around the world in a civil war breaking out, and he now sees pretty much all of those markers as being firmly entrenched in the UK. It's interesting that he's out there speaking, that he's being allowed to do that, whatever it is, that he's been given so much airtime that the mainstream media is picking up on this as well. I'm not quite sure what the underlying dynamic there is, but it genuinely does feel like it could get to that point. And of course, then you're going to have three parties to any UK civil war, which is going to be the British people themselves, the invaders, and the state. And if you believe the civil war has already started, well, two of those are ganging up against the other one.
I mean, I think that, I don't know, maybe I'm too much of a skeptic on Betts' narrative, because to me, the major question, and maybe this is my, American Southern brain, right? Which, I hear the word civil war and I get activated, but is basically who leads the natives, right? Like, where is that consolidated? And because I don't see that, and it's not that I don't want it. Believe me, if you guys had a second Cromwell, it would make me very, very happy. But nonetheless, right? Like, that is, I think, the thing that I find worrisome in this is like, okay, well, the state, it's easy to find who leads the state, right? You can look them up on the internet. It's pretty easy to find. With the invaders, right? It's like, well, okay, they may not have a consolidated leader, but they sort of exist in this sort of attack dog position, right? Where they are allied to the state and sort of pointed tactically. Whereas the natives, and I mean, even down to, Farage, right? Who seems to be sort of a very limp-wristed man, unwilling to sort of realize the position he is in. I guess I don't necessarily see there being a leader, and who knows, maybe that the hour will call to a man. But you have to look at what you consider to be a civil war. So you guys, obviously with your history, civil war might look very different for you guys in the past, because your last civil war looked actually much more like a series of mini nations in the form of states lining up against each other, and they had generals and capitals and all the rest of it. So it was fairly unique as civil wars go. It's going to be much more like, if anything, the Northern Ireland Troubles. And actually, for a large proportion of my life, probably half my life, the UK was in a civil war. So it's not that wild to think we could do it again. And yes, over time, a sort of leadership cadre evolved amongst that, but mainly it was sort of small cells of disaffected individuals taking actions, fairly minor actions, and we're already starting to see sort of some of the battle lines happening on this. So just the other week, a group of British lads were putting up flags in the sort of the raise the colours thing that I've already made reference to, and a couple of van loads of
of Pakistani guys pulled up and sort of attacked them with Molotov cocktails and baseball bats, and there was a standoff, and the police are still sort of desperately sort of covering up everything they can on that. So we're still trying to get some details on what actually happened there. But we do know one guy was hit by a Molotov. It's going to be things like that. It's going to be flares up, and perhaps as the English start to find their consciousness and they start to express themselves through the Raise the Colours campaign or whatever it is that they start to do, you'll get these sporadic flare-ups and these things will just escalate. So at the very minimum, our civil war would look like sustained post-Southport style protests and disruptions, but will probably break through into tit-for-tat battles between various minor groups that just escalates over the time. So maybe getting to something more like the Yugoslavian situation, or the Northern Ireland Troubles, rather than a two formalized sides that meet on the battlefield.
Fair enough. I realize, given the legal situation in your country, I will not ask you to comment past that point. I mean, Godspeed. I'll leave it at that. So,
well, I mean, it is something I think about a lot. I mean, I put up a possibly unwise tweet the other day, which is when the Epping case was reversed. I said, UK judges appear to like living dangerously, and I had a bit of cover here that Professor David Betts, that we've already mentioned, has highlighted that he thinks the thing that really kicks off some sort of conflict here would be the murder of a judge. So I was able to say, well, this is not my opinion. But Professor David Betts has said that a judge might be murdered, and therefore these UK judges appear to like living dangerously. There are things that I can certainly hint at, but I just need to be a little bit careful of making clear that it's not my opinion. So if anyone from the intelligence service is watching, I do not advocate any judge being strung up from a lamppost because of the series of ridiculous judgments that they've made over the years, which have led to the rape and murder of so many white children.
For legal reasons, I concur. Yeah, I think that was well said. I think that is in a broad sense, you see a lot of black pilling, in regards to the UK, and in a short-term sense, I understand it. Right, you and I have outlined a great number of problems facing your nation. But fundamentally, the English are an identifiable group with a very long culture who have gone through a lot of, this is almost tautology, right? But they've gone through an incredible amount of suffering. And to me, the situation is grim, but England will survive it. And that's what I find hopeful in all of this. Well,
a couple of things to say on that, if I may. I mean, the British people at one time ruled 2/3 of the world, so I'm pretty certain that when it comes time to act on this, that as a people we are more than capable of acting and doing something. The difference between when we ruled 2/3 of the world is that the British people and the British government were aligned with each other, and now they're diametrically opposed. So we can overcome that. The other thing is we have a different political system to you, in that your powers are separated over three branches of government, which, even if you get a reforming character come in, will try and stop him from actually doing anything about it.
Dan, can you think of any time that has ever happened before?
You may have covered this on your show somewhat over the last couple of years, or perhaps even last decade or so. We don't have that. We have a sort of single parliament, and that parliament is absolutely sovereign. It is not bound by anything. It's not bound by a court. It's not bound by a constitution. If it wants to pass a law that says, the sun will not rise tomorrow, it can do so. It doesn't necessarily stop the sun from rising, but it can pass basically any law that it wants to pass. So once we get a majority in parliament, what we can fix this extremely quickly. Any obstacle can be removed by a simple vote of parliament. Now, I don't think that Nigel Farage is that. I think Elon Musk was right, that Nigel doesn't have what it takes. And I feel a little sad for my countrymen, because when I have these sort of ad hoc conversations with random people, they get all excited about reform and about how things are going to change. I don't think it's going to be nearly as much change as they're looking for, because he's trying to play within the existing system. But once we get a true radical come along, actually we could turn this around incredibly quickly, and we can do mass deportations. We can do basically anything we want once we have the will to do so.
Well, and I think that's one of the other advantages to the fact that your immigration issue is a relatively recent problem in the grand scheme of things, right? And obviously, the longer someone has been there, the more difficult it is to get rid of them. Speaking in truly value neutral terms, and I mean, this is something we've seen in the U.S. I think that one of the more disheartening things, and I don't know why I am surprised that the media is full of the most horrible, evil people in the world, but the coverage around this has been just genuinely infuriating, right? I don't know if you saw, there was an article in it was The Guardian, I believe, and I realized, look, rage reacting to The Guardian is not, the height of, political commentary, but it was effectively the argument of the piece was something along the lines of, it's no shock that these men are committing crimes. They are, assaulting women because of how uncomfortable we have made them. Mm. And it's so clearly a cope, right? It's a very poor argument, but I think that it is encouraging to see the cultural perception shift to the point where clearly, right, this sort of protest movement has gained steam. Dan, we're almost coming up on time. Is there anything you want to say as we close this out?
No, I think we've covered the key points. I think I do have some optimism on this. I know it must look incredibly bleak from the outside looking into the UK, that we seem so passive in the face of all of this, and it is so intractable. But I genuinely believe that the moment there is the popular will to do so, this can be turned around incredibly quickly. We can put it all to bed. I mean, a lot of the reason why a lot of these people are coming here is because we have excessively generous welfare. And as you say, they are fairly recent arrivals. If we were to do something like, you're not eligible for government employment and, any welfare unless you have at least one British-born grandparent, for example, you would just have 10 million people leave. It simply takes the will to turn any of this around. And I believe that the British people have the resolution when it comes to it to act on all of this stuff. And we don't have the sort of government built-in impedancy that you guys might have that makes it difficult to turn things around when we want to. So, I mean, yes, it is bleak. I'm fairly indifferent as to whether this financial crisis happens. Well, I suppose I've got money here, so it would be. I mean, I would be affected more than most. But for the health of the nation, if it takes this impending financial crisis to be the thing that springs us out of it, but if it's not that, we will come back to it within a decade. I'm sure something is going to change. I suppose. Thanks very much for all the. I see it on Twitter all the time. The support from our American cousins. Who a lot of them express exactly the same sentiment that you expressed earlier, that somehow it infuriates you more to see it in the motherland. This is a place where it should not be happening. Very grateful for that support. And I think we're going to pull through it, but it might take a while.
No, I'm glad you brought up that last point. I've got it's just sitting on the shelf over there, right? A genealogical document, right? That, look, my family's been here since the 17th century. But I mean, look, Dan, there's a reason you and I at least look kind of similar, right? It's like there's a huge genetic component to it, let alone the cultural one. Mm. And there is a sense as well where it's like, America was always rough and ready. Things were never quite as, I guess there was less of a history there just by virtue of time, right? And so you even brought it up earlier, right? The fact that the Conservative Party, which I don't have an emotional tie to, but nonetheless is the oldest political party in the world, is being burnt to the ground. And for what? And I think that sentiment of, this beautiful thing being burnt to the ground and for what is sort of what runs through the whole thing. I share your optimism. I said it before, right? The English are a people who ruled the world. They've been around for a long time. Civilizations don't simply wink out like that, especially such a good one. But Dan, not to get too maudlin, but where can people find you? Where can they find more of your work?
Well, I've joined the Lotus Eaters. I've been with them for a couple of years. So that's Sargon of Akkad, that outfit. You can find us on YouTube, but also lotuseaters.com. I do the daily podcast there once or twice a week, and I've also got a series, Brokenomics, where I go into much more depth on the economic side of stuff. And actually, some news from today. Elon has said that he wants to come on, so that will be quite a big bag for an interview. I'm going to have to definitely muscle my way onto that panel when we get him on. But no, we're going from strength to strength. It's actually surprisingly one of the few UK businesses which is expanding rapidly. So come and check us out there. Yeah,
Dan and I did an interview over on Lotus Eaters. If you want to check that out, it's a great way to check out their content. All their stuff is well worth your time, especially that. Dan, that was, I think, my first or second ever interview on camera. And it's dramatically different when people can see your face. And so watching it back, I was like, oh, I need to calm down. I'm gesturing all over the place. I look like a crazy person. So thank you for helping me sort of get more used to that.
It was a great episode. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Yeah. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, you can either do that directly. Links down in the description. You can head over to Patreon or Substack, get the episodes early and ad-free, or you can check out Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching, our sponsor. Again, Dan, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.